I was reviewing an old gallery contract I had no particular reason to reread that afternoon, an old habit from over 50 years working as a studio glass artist, when a routine notification letter arrived from a regional auction house, informing me that one of my own early pieces had recently sold for a considerable sum, and that, per the terms of a recently updated agreement my daughter-in-law had apparently signed on my behalf, no resale royalty payment would be forthcoming on this particular sale. I remember setting that letter down slowly, my own reading glasses still perched on my nose, right before its contents rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had no idea that my daughter-in-law had quietly negotiated away my own contractual resale royalty rights I had spent decades establishing through careful negotiation with my longtime gallery, in exchange for a simplified bulk sale arrangement that benefited the gallery considerably more than it benefited me, and that within the following week I would formally invoke the specific authorization requirements in my own original gallery agreement to void that unauthorized change entirely. My name is Delphine Amaro. I'm 79 years old. I spent over 50 years as a studio glass artist, the kind of career that teaches you that a resale royalty right, once negotiated properly, represents real ongoing value that shouldn't simply be waved away as an administrative convenience. And teaches you, too, that handing someone authority to manage your estate affairs is an entirely different thing from handing them the authority to renegotiate contractual rights you spent decades establishing. My husband Thorstein died 5 years ago. A sudden heart attack while loading our own kiln for what would have been an ordinary afternoon firing. The kind of routine studio task that gave no warning at all. I remember finding him there, kiln door still open, the pieces he'd been loading scattered gently across the floor. Grief that arrives in the middle of the very work you both loved teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the sound of a kiln reaching temperature can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep firing that same kiln anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire creative partnership go untended. I began working in glass over 50 years ago, and Thorstein, a skilled metalworker himself, built much of my own studio equipment by hand, understanding exactly what my particular technique required. Over the decades, my work found genuine recognition, several pieces held in respected private collections, my own reputation growing steadily within the studio glass world. About 25 years ago, once my work began commanding genuinely significant prices, I negotiated with my longtime gallery's own careful cooperation a formal resale royalty provision into our representation agreement, guaranteeing me a specific percentage of any future resale of my own work through recognized auction channels, a right increasingly common among established artists, but one that required deliberate, careful negotiation to actually secure. That agreement, and my own name as its signatory, remained the single most important protection of my work's own ongoing value throughout my career. Thorstein and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a metalworker for nearly 40 years, meticulous with every fitting, the kind of man who built much of my own studio equipment by hand, simply because he understood exactly what my particular technique required. When I told him, 3 years into our marriage, that I wanted to pursue serious glasswork rather than continue teaching part-time art classes, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with a young family at home. He told me he'd handle every evening dinner on my longest studio nights, and he did for years without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully finished piece at a time, over 50 years at that kiln until I finally began scaling back with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young glassblower early in my own career, a man convinced he'd never develop the confidence to work molten glass at genuine speed, whom I spent an entire season quietly mentoring after our shared studio hours, never once mentioning to the cooperative's board how much extra time it actually required. He went on to run his own respected studio for over 2 decades, and years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let him give up on his own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before I ever imagined needing that same careful instinct applied to protecting my own contractual rights. I have 2 children. Undine, my daughter, is an art conservator 3 time zones away, precise and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope a conservator's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, a habit that started the year Thorstein died, and never once lapsed since. My son Barrington is 44, works in arts administration himself, married for 8 years to a woman named Zephyrine Lovelace, 36, whose growing background in gallery management he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making a significant unauthorized decision sound like simple administrative streamlining. Zephyrine grew up in a family that valued efficient, simplified business relationships considerably more than protecting an individual artist's own specific negotiated rights, the kind of household where a clean, straightforward arrangement was considered inherently better than one carrying additional complexity, regardless of what that complexity actually protected. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's instinct towards simplification comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that instinct indefinitely, especially once it starts threatening rights you spent decades negotiating carefully. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Barrington, back when we still spoke easily and often about her own father's small gallery business, how he used to encourage artists to accept simplified, all-inclusive representation deals rather than negotiate individual clauses, believing complexity itself scared away buyers, regardless of how much value it might actually protect for the artist. My dad always said the cleanest contract sells the fastest, she told me. I grew up believing that simplicity itself was the goal, regardless of what specific protections might get quietly smoothed away in pursuit of it. I remember thinking at the time that it reflected a genuinely practical business instinct in her family. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around treating negotiated complexity as an obstacle rather than protection, and that my own decades-old resale royalty provision would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to without my consent. My own days since scaling back had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm, coffee at my own kitchen table most mornings, an hour or 2 in the studio, simply tidying old tools out of habit, the occasional call from a former colleague looking to catch up. It was, by most measures, a peaceful life, one I'd built carefully in the years since Thorstein died, and one that made an ordinary Tuesday afternoon's mail feel, at first, like nothing more than routine correspondence. Barrington met Zephyrine at a regional arts benefit he'd attended for his own administrative work, and I remember the first time he brought her by my own studio, watching her examine several finished pieces with genuine informed appreciation, asking thoughtful questions about market value and collector interest that suggested real professional curiosity rather than polite small talk. I remember thinking, watching that first visit, how naturally capable she seemed, exactly the kind of steady professional mind this part of my life could benefit from having close by. I would think about that first visit considerably more in a different light once I understood how selectively that same capability eventually got applied. About 2 years ago, as I found myself increasingly overwhelmed managing my own gallery correspondence and various administrative matters alone, Zephyrine offered to help, given her own professional background in exactly this kind of gallery relationship management. I welcomed her help gratefully at first, genuinely relieved to have someone knowledgeable managing details I found increasingly difficult to keep up with alone. I did make clear early on that any actual change to my existing gallery agreement, particularly regarding my own resale royalty provisions, required my own direct, explicit review and signature before taking effect. She told me she understood completely. It would take nearly 2 years of careful, escalating deviation before I understood exactly how much that understanding had actually meant. For the first several months, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Zephyrine's own genuine organizational skill helping me manage correspondence and scheduling considerably more efficiently. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was when Zephyrine mentioned, almost as an aside, that the gallery had proposed a simplified bulk representation agreement that would streamline how multiple pieces got handled during any future estate transition, framing the proposal as simply administrative convenience rather than something requiring my own careful, direct review of the actual terms. The second incident happened when I discovered, entirely by accident reviewing my own gallery correspondence out of habit, that Zephyrine had been in direct discussions with the gallery's own management about restructuring several provisions in my existing agreement. Discussions that had apparently progressed considerably further than I'd realized, without my own direct participation in any of those specific conversations. The third incident happened when Barrington mentioned to me, during an ordinary visit, that Zephyrine had been working considerably harder than usual lately on what he understood to be some kind of estate planning project related to my own gallery relationship, though he admitted a little sheepishly that he hadn't followed the specific details closely himself. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Zephyrine on a phone call with the gallery's own director, discussing the specific terms of a proposed bulk sale arrangement in language that made clear the resale royalty provision would be waived entirely in exchange for a simplified, upfront payment structure. Terms that sounded, even to my own experienced ear, considerably less favorable than what my original carefully negotiated agreement actually guaranteed. The fifth incident happened during an ordinary dinner when Zephyrine mentioned, brightly, that she'd finally gotten the gallery to agree to a specific, streamlined new arrangement, framing the change itself as an impressive administrative achievement rather than something I'd had any opportunity to evaluate against my own original agreement's actual value. "Delphinia, isn't that wonderful?" she said, glancing at me with genuine, apparently unguarded excitement. "It's so much simpler than dealing with all those separate royalty calculations every time." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law describe surrendering a decades-long contractual protection as straightforward simplification, as though my own careful original negotiation and decades of established professional reputation were an inconvenient complication rather than the very protection my work's own ongoing value actually depended upon. The sixth incident happened when Zephyrine own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter handle complex gallery negotiations with such natural confidence. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for cutting through complicated arrangements and finding the cleanest, most efficient solution. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular unease of understanding that a genuinely significant surrender of value was being publicly celebrated as simple efficiency. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when Zephyrine mentioned, casually, that she'd asked the gallery's own legal team to prepare the final updated agreement ahead of time, just so everything would be ready to move quickly once we'd finalized the last few details together. A description that made the actual drafting of a binding contractual amendment sound like simple administrative convenience, rather than something requiring my own careful legal review before it ever existed in finished form at all. The eighth incident happened when I overheard Zephyrine on a call with a fellow gallery manager, describing the newly simplified arrangement as a model other artists' estates might benefit from adopting. Language that treated the surrendered royalty provision as an innovative administrative improvement rather than a significant financial concession that had never actually been my own informed choice. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment something feels wrong. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Zephyrine is just being helpful the way capable people are. Barrington loves me, even if he doesn't ask more questions about his own wife's project. Nothing is actually final until I sign something myself, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that a decision requiring genuine expertise and careful evaluation had been quietly reduced to a simple, celebratory dinner announcement. There was one afternoon, about a month before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to addressing this more directly. Zephyrine mentioned, during an ordinary phone call, that the paperwork was nearly finalized, and that she'd bring it by soon so I could simply review and sign whenever convenient, framing the entire process as a formality rather than something requiring my own genuinely careful, independent evaluation first. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud exactly how uncomfortable this entire process had made me. Then I thought about Barrington's own happiness, about how much he valued his wife's initiative, about how a direct confrontation might feel like an attack on something he was genuinely proud of her for handling. I let the comment pass and told myself one more time that the moment to address this fully hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the letter from the auction house. I opened that routine notification at my own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, informing me plainly that one of my own early pieces, a significant work I remembered creating decades earlier, during a genuinely formative period in my career, had sold at auction for a substantial sum, and that no resale royalty payment would be issued, per updated representation terms the gallery understood to have been properly authorized. I sat with that letter for a long time, understanding with total clarity exactly what had actually happened, that Zephyrine had signed away, on my behalf, a protection I had spent decades establishing without my own actual informed authorization ever genuinely being obtained. I called Barrington immediately. "Barrington," I said, "I need you and Zephyrine here tonight. I just received notification that my resale royalty rights have apparently been waived entirely, on a sale that should have earned me a significant amount. When they arrived, I set the letter on my own kitchen table between us. "This is what's actually been happening," I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be. Somewhere along the way, the gallery came to believe my resale royalty provision had been properly waived through an updated agreement, and I never actually reviewed or signed anything reflecting that change myself. Zephyryn's face went pale. "I thought the streamlined agreement covered general administrative matters," she said. "I didn't realize the specific royalty waiver was actually included in the final version, or that it had already been submitted to the gallery as finalized. It was included," I told her, "and it just cost me a significant amount of money on a single sale alone, with potentially many more sales still to come. This wasn't a general administrative matter. It was a specific, valuable contractual right I spent decades establishing." I called my old friend Petronilla before I called my attorney, a woman I'd worked alongside for decades in the same regional artists cooperative, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a resale royalty provision actually meant to an artist's own long-term financial security. I told her the whole story: nearly 2 years of gradual erosion, the auction house's own letter, my own genuine shock at what had actually been signed away. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Delphine," she finally said, "you spent decades teaching younger artists in our own cooperative exactly why a resale royalty provision mattered, precisely because so many artists sell early work for very little before their reputation grows. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the person who signed it away happens to be family herself. I keep waiting to feel like I'm overreacting to some paperwork confusion," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Petronilla said, "because you're not overreacting. Someone signed away a specific, valuable contractual right you spent decades establishing without your own actual informed authorization, and you only found out because an auction house sent a routine notice. That's not an overreaction. That's exactly the alarm that situation actually required." I called my attorney, a sharp, long-time professional acquaintance named Ferdinanda Vaughan, whom I'd worked with for years on various matters related to my own original gallery agreement. I explained the situation plainly: the specific royalty waiver, the auction sale, my own genuine lack of informed authorization for the actual change. "Delphinia," she said after reviewing the documentation herself, "your original agreement's own amendment provisions require your explicit direct signature for any modification to the royalty terms specifically. Based on what you're describing, that requirement was never actually properly satisfied. We have real grounds to formally void this particular amendment entirely. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do, because I think it matters. I did not accuse Zephyryn of deliberate financial harm, nor did I act out of pure anger." Ferdinanda and I formally notified the gallery, citing the original agreement's own explicit authorization requirements, that the recent amendment waiving my resale royalty rights had never actually received my own required signature, and that the original royalty provision therefore remained fully in effect, including for the recent sale that had prompted this entire discovery. Barrington called me the following morning, his voice tight with genuine concern rather than his usual calm. "Mom, could this actually damage your relationship with the gallery after all these years?" "I understand that's a real concern," I said calmly, "but a specific, valuable right I spent decades establishing was waived without my own actual authorization, and I'm simply asking the gallery to honor the agreement I actually signed, not one that got quietly modified without my genuine informed consent. I had no idea it had gotten this far, he said quietly. I trusted Zephyrine understanding of the gallery relationship and never asked enough questions about the actual contractual specifics. That trust wasn't unreasonable, I told him, but a decision this significant, one that actually surrendered real ongoing value, needed considerably more scrutiny than either of us gave it. Zephyrin came to see me alone 2 days later, considerably more subdued than I'd ever seen her, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I didn't fully understand how significant the actual royalty provision was, she admitted, her voice barely steady. I thought of it as sort of a minor administrative detail compared to the bigger, cleaner arrangement I was trying to help set up. It was never simply a minor detail, I told her. It's a specific, negotiated right that's protected my own work's ongoing financial value for decades. Waving it away nearly cost me significant income, not just on this one sale, but potentially on every future sale of my work for the rest of my life. I know that now, she said, her eyes filling. I don't know how I convinced myself that streamlining the paperwork and giving up real financial value were the same thing. I considered her admission for a long moment before responding. They're not remotely the same thing, Zephyrine, and the gap between them nearly cost me a considerable amount of my own actual protected value. Given Zephyrine's full cooperation in supporting the formal correction and her genuine willingness to understand exactly what had gone wrong, Ferdinanda and the gallery's own legal department worked together to formally reinstate the original royalty provision in full, applying it retroactively to the recent sale that had prompted the discovery, and requiring my own direct, explicit signature for any future modification of any kind. The weeks that followed the immediate resolution were still difficult ones, even after the formal correction had been secured. Barrington struggled visibly with understanding how close his own mother's financial protection had come to permanent loss without his full awareness. Undine, once she heard the whole story, offered to review the gallery's own updated documentation herself, confirming from her own professional perspective exactly how the corrected agreement now properly protected my own ongoing interests. About 3 weeks after the resolution, Barrington came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about watching you and Dad build that studio together, piece by piece, he said. I don't know when I started assuming a gallery agreement was just paperwork rather than the actual thing, protecting decades of your own work's real value. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you ask more questions sooner before it went this far? Because I trusted Zephyrines' professional background more than I questioned the actual contractual specifics, he said. I think I forgot that trusting someone's general competence and verifying a legally binding decision aren't the same thing. Zephyrine and I talked at length several more times over the following weeks, working through not just the practical correction, but the deeper misunderstanding that had allowed things to progress as far as they had. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually costing you real, lasting value, she admitted during one of those later conversations. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Delphinia, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to prove I could handle something significant on my own. That desire is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine organizational talent. I only ever wanted a decision this significant to receive the same careful scrutiny any properly negotiated contract actually deserves. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted. about how easily wanting to prove my own competence turned into moving faster than the actual decision deserved. I think I convinced myself that bringing you a finished solution would feel more impressive than bringing you an honest, ongoing conversation about the actual terms. So I stopped slowing down long enough to actually confirm what I was agreeing to on your behalf. You were never entitled to finalize something this significant without proper authorization, Zephyrine, I told her. But you were always entitled to ask me directly, honestly, about what a genuinely careful negotiation might actually require. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever actually available to you. I don't know how to undo what almost happened, she said. You don't undo a near miss, I told her. You account for it honestly, which you have, and then you spend considerable time afterward proving, through small, consistent carefulness, that you understand exactly why that scrutiny mattered as much as it did. We talked for nearly 2 hours that particular afternoon about Thorstein, about the studio, about what genuine patience with something valuable actually required. I showed her my own original gallery agreement. Decades of careful amendments and updates Thorstein and I had negotiated properly over the years, work that had taken considerable patience to get right each time. Zephyrine looked through those documents slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me and Ferdinanda develop a clear, written framework for evaluating any future gallery decision, something considerably more rigorous than excitement about a quick simplification. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Barrington and Zephyrine began attending an arts business workshop together that autumn, specifically to better understand how significant contractual decisions needed to be properly vetted and authorized within an existing legal relationship. Zephyrine told me later that the instructor had used almost the exact language Ferdinanda had used with our own situation, describing exactly the kind of undervalued waiver Zephyrine had nearly finalized as a common, serious risk when family members manage an artist's own estate affairs without full understanding of the underlying contracts. I called Ferdinanda a few weeks after everything settled to update her on how the correction had actually unfolded. Delphinia, I've handled a lot of these contractual disputes over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of an amendment authorization requirement I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure instinct than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You spent decades training yourself to never accept a summary over the actual document. That instinct protected your own financial security considerably more than anyone else at that kitchen table fully understood in the moment. Undine flew in for the holiday gathering that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once, my own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Barrington and Zephyrine drove over with a pie Zephyrine had made herself. No elaborate presentation, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Undine's husband Frobisher asked, innocently enough, how the whole situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story, secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Zephyrine simply said, I nearly cost this family real value because I let excitement about simplifying things replace actual careful verification. Delphinia made sure that never became final. I'm still working to earn back the trust that near miss cost. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Frobisher, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Zephyrine how it had felt, realizing the actual value that had nearly been signed away. Zephyrine was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. "Humbling isn't a strong enough word," she said. "I think I finally understood what it costs someone else when you let a clean, simple story replace an honest accounting of what's actually being given up." I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant holiday table. Zephyrine called her own father that same autumn, correcting at last the way she'd absorbed his particular philosophy about simplified contracts always being better contracts. Barrington told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her father's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that he'd never actually stopped to consider how many artists his own encouragement toward simplified deals might have genuinely cost real value over the years. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Barrington's or Zephyrines' own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a philosophy about contracts she'd apparently absorbed without ever fully examining it herself. A few weeks after that gathering, a card arrived in my mailbox, Barrington's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written considerably more than a few lines. "Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Zephyrines' excitement about this arrangement go unquestioned instead of actually understanding the numbers myself. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually ask real questions about significant decisions from now on, rather than simply trusting general competence to cover specific details. Thank you for handling something this significant with more patience than I think I would have managed myself." Tucked inside the same envelope was a considerably longer letter in Zephyrines' own handwriting. "Delphinia, I nearly signed away decades of your actual protected value because moving quickly felt more impressive than moving carefully. I'm sorry it took you catching that auction house letter yourself for me to understand what that speed could have actually cost you." I folded both letters carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside my own original gallery agreement, a small, permanent record of exactly how seriously that careful negotiation had always needed to be protected. I saw Petronilla again that spring over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week of that difficult letter. I told her about the reinstated agreement, the workshop, the honest letters. Petronilla listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. "I told you it would matter, reading every single page yourself," she said. "Most people don't take the time, even when their own instincts are practically shouting at them to slow down. You did, and look what it actually protected. Not just the royalty, the truth back." I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the entire time. "Do you regret any of it?" Petronilla asked gently. "The near miss? All of it?" "I don't regret any of it," I told her. "I regret, considerably more, that it took an actual auction house notice to make me finally insist on the same careful scrutiny I'd spent decades applying to every contract I ever signed myself. I think I needed that alarm in some strange way to finally understand exactly how thoroughly excitement alone can fail to protect something without genuine, independent verification behind it. I think about that ordinary Tuesday afternoon often, my own reading glasses catching a routine notice. I suspect nobody expected me to examine that closely. Decades of protected value resting on whether I actually read every single line myself. At the moment, it felt like an uncomfortable confrontation. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something considerably more honest. A family finally required to reckon directly with how easily genuine care can be quietly replaced by convenient excitement. I don't regret welcoming Zephyrine help with the gallery relationship originally. Genuine organizational expertise within a family mattered to me then, and it still matters to me now. What I regret is that documentation and general trust alone, without any actual independent verification, nearly allowed a genuinely poor decision to become permanent. Real stewardship of something this meaningful was never meant to depend entirely on trust without any actual scrutiny. And I intend to make certain any future decision about my own work's protections receives the same careful, independent review for as long as I'm able to insist on it. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that careful documentation alone was sufficient protection, that a good contract simply needed accurate records, rather than periodic, genuinely independent verification against reality. I no longer believe that. Documentation without verification isn't actually protection. It's simply a record of what should be true, vulnerable to anyone excited enough or careless enough to quietly make it false. The difference matters enormously, and I learned that difference considerably more urgently than I ever should have needed to. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while they were actually happening. The streamlined bulk agreement described as simple efficiency. The direct negotiations with the gallery conducted without my presence. The finished paperwork described as a simple formality. Each one, individually, seemed like reasonable, helpful initiative. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern that moved consistently toward finalizing something significant before I ever had genuine opportunity to properly evaluate it myself. Real stewardship, I've come to believe, was never actually about refusing all administrative modernization or initiative. It was about building periodic, independent verification into any arrangement involving something this meaningful. Precisely because trust alone, however genuinely felt, cannot actually catch a genuinely poor deal dressed up as simple convenience. If something feels rushed, even when you can't immediately articulate why, that instinct deserves genuine, independent verification, not simply patient trust extended indefinitely. I think of it now the way I used to think about a fellow artist's overly confident assumption that a gallery's own summary of a new contract's terms could be trusted without reading the actual document themselves. You can trust the summary if you want to, but real diligence means actually reading the underlying terms yourself, regardless of how persuasive the summary sounds. I think sometimes about all those years working in glass, learning that every genuinely sound piece depends on understanding exactly how the material actually behaves, not simply hoping it will do what you expect. It took me 79 years and one very ordinary auction house letter to apply that same standard fully to my own family's most meaningful remaining protection. I welcome Zephyrine help freely and give everything I now understand. I would still welcome genuine help freely again, though considerably more wisely, with periodic independent verification built in from the very beginning. I no longer accept excitement alone as sufficient justification for a significant contractual decision. If I am the one who spent decades establishing something this valuable, I intend to remain the one actively protecting its actual value. Not because I distrust everyone who offers to help, but because pretending verification was ever unnecessary was never actually true. My work continues generating its full protected royalty on every resale now, exactly the way it always should have, Zephyrine always asking me directly now, before any significant gallery conversation, whether an independent evaluation has actually confirmed the terms she's excited about. Undine flew in specially for last year's annual gallery relationship review, standing beside me at my own kitchen table with genuine warmth on her face, watching Zephyrine ask Ferdinanda detailed, careful questions about exactly what a proposed contract update would actually mean before committing to anything further. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 2 years. I am 79 years old, a widow, a retired studio glass artist, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who trusts documentation and general goodwill alone to protect something genuinely meaningful without ever independently verifying that trust against reality. That particular version of me stayed behind at an ordinary kitchen table, along with a routine auction house letter that nobody in this family will ever quite forget receiving. I opened that letter that afternoon as one woman, and I closed it as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Zephyrine first offered to help with the gallery relationship. Knowing everything I know now, I tell them the truth. I would welcome that help again because her genuine organizational talent was never actually the problem, and her offer at the time came from a place I still believe was genuinely well-intentioned. The mistake was assuming that documentation and trust alone, without any periodic independent verification, could fully protect something this valuable from someone genuinely excited enough, under real enough pressure to prove herself, to move considerably faster than proper diligence actually allowed. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the help I welcomed. It would be the near total absence of any independent verification until the very last possible moment. A gap that nearly allowed real, lasting harm to become permanent. Barrington's own son asked me once, sitting on a stool near the cooling kiln during a visit, why Grandma cared so much about a piece of paper when the actual glass was the real art. I told him honestly that the paper protected the glass, in a way making sure that decades from now, long after I'm gone, the work itself would still be honestly valued and properly credited to the person who actually made it. He asked if he could watch me finish a small piece, and I let him, walking him slowly through every careful step, understanding that teaching him to actually see the patient work behind each finished piece mattered every bit as much as any contract ever could. My own grandchildren know the whole story now, each one told honestly, exactly what nearly happened to their own grandmother's careful life's work, and exactly how that near miss was eventually properly corrected instead. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete, the original, careful negotiation, the near-permanent surrender, the eventual honest correction, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually understands what patient, careful work is genuinely worth. These days, when anyone asks about the small royalty checks that still arrive whenever an early piece resells, they hear the whole story, years of careful negotiation, a near miss nobody saw coming, and a family that learned, considerably more urgently than it should have needed to, exactly what genuine stewardship of something meaningful actually requires. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of that protection's value as I always should have been.